The town of Hemlock Reach sat hard against the Arizona borderlands like it had been built out of necessity, not ambition. By late autumn 1873, the wind had changed, colder in the mornings, dry and sharp as it passed over the rooftops and through the spaces between buildings that had seen too many years and too few repairs. People kept their heads down. The kind of town where nobody asked questions unless it was about their own business. Sheriff Thorne Gallen, 53 years old, 6 foot even, with shoulders that hadn't quite lost the weight of war, stepped out from his small office just after first light. His boots hit the boardwalk with the same weight each morning, slow and even. His revolver hung at his side, untouched for weeks. He wore it because he had to, not because he wanted to. The law was a habit now, not a calling. Thorne hadn't always been alone. He'd come back from a war in '65 with a new bride, a woman named Annalise who taught piano and grew tomatoes along the windowsill. She died in childbirth 9 years ago, and the baby girl hadn't lived more than a day. Since then, he stayed in Hemlock Reach, working the badge, patching up disputes, arresting drunks, keeping things moving just enough to not fall apart. He kept to himself, ate at the same table, slept in the same bed, never replaced the cradle in the corner of the bedroom, never took down her shawl from the nail on the wall. This morning felt like any other. Quiet, dry, no sounds but the faint creak of the saloon sign on its chain and the low grunt of oxen from the stables. Thorne turned toward the depot out of habit, ready to make a loop through the northern end of town before stopping by Hartley's store for coffee grounds. But then he saw her. She sat on a splintered shipping crate just outside the depot office, elbows on her knees, hands clutched together like she didn't trust what she was holding. She looked no older than 17. Her brown hair was tied back loosely, but strands had come loose in the wind. Her coat wasn't hers. It looked like a man's jacket, hanging off her shoulders awkwardly. Her dress was plain, threadbare near the cuffs, and her shoes didn't match. One boot half-laced, the other almost too small. A cracked leather valise sat next to her feet. One of the latches was broken, and the fabric around the handle was split. On top, wrapped in a frayed bit of flannel, sat a small photo frame, its glass chipped and backing warped. She stared at the ground. Her eyes weren't red, but the skin around them was tight, like she'd cried before but ran out of tears. Thorne stopped, looked at her a moment longer. He wasn't a man to get involved with strangers easily. But this wasn't a stranger who needed scolding or paperwork. This was someone who had clearly been left behind, on purpose. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching over grit. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, his voice even quiet. The girl didn't move for a second. Then she looked up. Her eyes were blue but dulled, ringed by shadows. "They already left," she said. Her voice cracked halfway through. "You from a stage?" She nodded. They said I wasn't their problem anymore. Thor didn't press for names. Didn't ask who they were. It didn't matter, not right now. "What's your name?" "Clara. Clara Nels." Her voice dropped so low at the end he had to watch her lips to catch it. He looked over the depot. No one else lingered. The stage had rolled off east not 10 minutes ago, and the depot clerk wouldn't be back until mid-morning. No witnesses, no escorts, no kin. "You eat today?" She hesitated, then shook her head. He studied her face, drawn, pale, eyes raw. She wasn't drunk, wasn't dangerous, just lost, cold, cast off. Without another word, he took off his long wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched. Her body tensed, like she'd expected a strike, not kindness. "You're not nothing," he said flatly. He meant it. He didn't know why he said it. He just did. She looked up again, eyes darting to his face. It wasn't disbelief, it was confusion, like no one had said something that plain to her in a long time. He picked up her bag. It was light, too light. He could feel the rattle of whatever was inside. The frame, maybe a book, maybe some clothes. No food, no blanket, no shoes. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "Then come on." She didn't ask questions, didn't ask why he was helping. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she couldn't afford to. They walked in silence, down Main Street, past the church that hadn't held service in 3 Sundays, past the saloon with the broken shutter, past 2 men on the porch of the general store who watched but said nothing. He led her around the side of the sheriff's office, up two creaking steps, and into his own house. The door opened to the kitchen. The stove still held a bit of heat from the fire he banked the night before. A pot of coffee sat cold on the edge of the iron plate. Bread on the counter. A few slices of smoked ham in a tin box beside it. He stepped aside and let her in. She hesitated just inside the threshold, then stepped over slowly. Her boots made no sound on the wooden floor. "You can sit," he said, nodding toward the table. "You can eat." She nodded again, but didn't move right away. He set the valise down near the door and poured a glass of water, handed it to her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. She didn't drink. Thorne pulled out a chair and sat across from her, not close, just present. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer stories. He just watched, steady calm, giving her room to breathe. After a minute, she reached for the bread and tore off a piece. She chewed slowly, eyes on the table. Her hands never stopped shaking. Thorne stood, lit the small lamp on the mantel, then walked into the next room, leaving the door open. His bedroom was spare, a narrow bed, a dresser with two drawers, a wash basin, a shelf with a few folded shirts. On the wall, a nail held a faded shawl. On the dresser, a small box with two names etched on the top. He didn't open it. Back in the kitchen, the girl, Clara, sat still, chewing slower now, eyes wandering across the room. She noticed the worn floorboard near the hearth, the set of empty hooks near the stove, the fact there was only one plate in the rack. He stood in the hall, arms crossed, watching the faint movement of her shadow under the doorframe. He didn't know why this girl had been left. Didn't know what kind of people could put someone on a stage and just leave her behind. But he did know one thing. She wasn't nothing. And as long as she was in hemlock reach, she wasn't going to be alone. The light outside dimmed early that evening, pressed down by thick gray clouds that held the smell of snow even if it hadn't yet fallen. Inside Thorne Gallon's house, the stillness was heavier than usual, interrupted only by the soft clink of tin utensils and the occasional pop from the wood stove. Clara had eaten what she could, a small piece of ham, another slice of bread, and most of the water, but her shoulders stayed tense. Her eyes constantly flicked toward the door like she expected someone to knock and tell her this had all been a mistake. Thorne didn't ask her where she'd come from, not in words, but his eyes stayed on her longer than they had earlier. He studied the way she kept her hands in her lap, how she flinched when the fire crackled too loud, and how her face went blank each time she noticed something small, like the cradle-shaped dent in the wood near the corner or the absence of photographs on the walls. She noticed details, and she wasn't comfortable with silence, but she didn't fill it either. After clearing the table, Thorne poured her another glass of water. She took it, said nothing, and looked down into it as though expecting something more. "You got family west?" he asked finally, keeping his tone neutral. She didn't answer at first. Then she nodded, slowly. "Had. My uncle's family. Mother's brother. They were headed for California. Didn't want to carry me that far." He waited. "They said I was too quiet. Said I didn't work hard enough. Didn't help with the cooking." Her voice was dry, matter of fact. "Said I looked like my mother. He didn't like my mother." Thorne sat back in the chair and said nothing. He understood enough. He'd seen it before. Folks on the road looking to lighten their load. Some did it with baggage. Some did it with people. "They gave me $2 in coins," she added after a moment. "Said it was more than I'd earned." She looked up. "I lost the coins getting off the stage." He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. She didn't look like she wanted comfort. She looked like she wanted truth. "They gone for good?" he asked. She nodded again. Thorne stood and moved to the shelf beside the stove. He took down a folded wool blanket, laid it over the back of the smaller chair in the front room. "You can take the cot," he said. "I'll be across the hall if anything's wrong." Clara looked toward the door leading to the back of the house. She didn't move. "Window's got a latch," he added. "No one can come in." She hesitated, then rose, arms wrapped tight across her chest. She stepped into the next room without a word. When she passed through the doorway, she looked back just once. Thorne didn't follow. He stood near the stove, poked at the coals, and then set another log in the firebox. The heat pushed back gently. Outside, the wind picked up. He thought about asking her more. About her parents, about where she came from, how long she'd been on the road. But questions like that weren't kindness, they were weight. And she'd carried enough. Instead, he sat down, pulled off his boots, and leaned back in the old chair by the hearth. He let the quiet settle. It didn't feel uncomfortable tonight, just strange, the kind of quiet that held something in it. The next morning came without any sound. Thorne stirred before sunrise as usual, dressed quickly, boiled coffee over the coals, and fried 2 eggs in an iron pan that hadn't seen use in weeks. When he turned, she was already standing in the kitchen doorway, coat still wrapped tight, her eyes slightly puffy but clearer than the night before. "You sleep?" he asked. She shrugged. He slid one of the eggs onto a plate and handed it to her without ceremony. "There's bread. Eat what you can." She took the plate without speaking and sat at the table. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. After breakfast, he stepped outside, boots crunching over the frost-covered porch, and walked to the well. He drew 2 buckets, one for the wash basin, one for cooking, and brought them back in. Claire was already washing the plate she'd used. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I can," she replied, "if I'm staying." He nodded once, set the buckets near the stove, then stepped out again, walking the short path toward the town's main street. He kept to his usual patrol route, past the tailor shop, behind the livery, through the yard behind the mercantile. No trouble, no sounds, just the normal sense of quiet that hung over Hemlock Reach this time of year. But as he passed the church, he caught the tail end of a conversation. 2 women on the steps whispering about the girl left behind, wondering what the sheriff thought he was doing, taking her in like that. He didn't stop. He didn't answer, but he filed it away. Hemlock Reach didn't take kindly to surprises. And folks who didn't speak much often stirred more talk than the ones who did. By midday, he was back home. Clara was sitting on the porch steps, coat still on, hands clasped between her knees. She looked up as he approached. "I could help with something," she said before he spoke. "You don't have to. I know. I want to." He studied her face for a moment. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just needed to move, to do something with her hands, something that made her real. He pointed toward the woodshed. "We're short on firewood. I'll split. You carry." And that was how the day passed. No talking, just work. The soft thud of axe against wood, the sound of her footsteps carrying the split logs back to the porch. No arguments, no awkwardness, just labor. Shared. That night, she fell asleep early, this time under the blanket, boots off, arms not clutched so tightly. Thorne sat at the hearth again, staring at the flames, feeling something shift in the room. Not loud, not sudden, just quieter than the quiet before. And he realized something. She didn't need a rescue. She needed space. And for the first time in years, maybe he needed someone to fill the air who didn't demand anything more than a place to breathe. Tomorrow would come, and she'd still be there. And for now, that was enough. By the 3rd morning, the wind had shifted again. The skies above Hemlock Reach had turned a pale white gray, and the stillness that settled over the town felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was holding its breath before snow. Sheriff Thorne Gallen stood at the kitchen counter, cutting thick slices of bread with steady hands. Behind him, the stove crackled, warming the room just enough to chase the cold from the floorboards. He didn't speak as Clara entered, but he noticed the way she moved, less rigid, more sure-footed, like she was beginning to remember how to occupy space without apology. She sat at the table, hands wrapped around the cup of boiled chicory he'd poured without asking. Her coat was draped over the back of the chair now. She wore a dress he recognized as one that had belonged to his late wife, altered at the seams with uneven stitches from Clara's hand. It didn't fit perfectly, but it was clean, and it no longer dragged the floor. "You sleep better last night?" he asked. She nodded, took a sip, then added, "You don't talk much." He gave a slow shrug. "Don't need to." She didn't laugh, but something softened in her face. The day moved slowly, as most did that time of year. After breakfast, Clara took to sweeping the floors while Thorne walked the northern ridge, checking on cattle fences for the Myers family, whose oldest boy had been laid up with a broken arm. He spoke only when necessary, waved off conversation when offered, and returned by mid-afternoon to the sight of Clara sitting on the front step, her hands red from scrubbing laundry in cold water, her breath rising in clouds as she warmed them by the firewood pile. She looked up as he approached. I boiled the hand towels and cleaned the shelf above the stove, she said plainly. There were beans back there with weevils. He nodded. Should have tossed those a while ago. I did. He gave her a glance. You want to do all that? I don't want to feel like a burden. Thorne didn't answer right away. He looked out across the town, quiet under the late light. You're not. Later that evening, as the snow began to drift in small, deliberate flakes, Clara stood beside the kitchen window, watching the town fade into soft gray. Why do you stay? She asked. Thorne sat by the stove, boots off, cup in hand. Here. She nodded. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly. Then, he said, because no one asked me to leave. She turned toward him, curious. My wife died here. My daughter didn't live long enough to see a season. But this town, it didn't push me out. I had the badge. I had work. That was enough. Is it still enough? He didn't know how to answer that. Not yet. So he didn't try. Clara didn't press. Instead, she crossed the room, pulled a folded cloth from her bag, and unwrapped the cracked photo frame she'd carried with her since the stage depot. She sat on the corner of the table. This was my mother, she said, before she got sick, before she married the wrong man. She wanted to teach reading to children. That's what she told me. Thorne studied the image, grainy, slightly smudged, a woman with steady eyes and a tight-lipped smile. The frame was chipped at the corners, but the glass had been cleaned. Looks like she'd have been good at it, he said. Clara nodded slowly. She died when I was 10. After that, I stayed with relatives. They didn't want me. I guess they made that real clear by the time we got to Arizona. Thor didn't ask what had happened in those years. He could guess, and he learned long ago that forcing someone to say it aloud didn't make the memory easier to bear. She returned the photo to her valise, folding the cloth around it with care. I know I'm not supposed to still be here. That someone will ask questions eventually. They can ask, Thorne replied. Don't mean I'll answer. Clara looked at him. Why did you take me in? He stood, moved slowly to the sink to rinse out his cup. Didn't see any other soul offering. She waited, watching his back. That the only reason? She asked. He paused. No. She didn't push further. That night, before turning in, Thorne checked the latch on her window himself, making sure it caught. He placed a second quilt at the end of the cot. When she entered the room, she noticed both things but said nothing. She only gave a small nod and folded the quilt over her arms. The wind outside picked up just after midnight. A shutter rattled once before settling. Inside the small house, everything stayed quiet. In that silence, both of them, without saying it, began to believe that maybe they didn't have to return to what they'd known before. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage, Clara didn't sleep in her coat. The snow came harder by morning, blanketing the ridge and whitening the rooftops of Hemlock Reach in silence. Smoke rose in soft streams from the chimneys scattered across the town, but few people stirred early. Most had the sense to stay inside on a morning like this, where every gust of wind carried with it the bite of winter settling in for good. Thorne stepped out onto the porch, his coat collar turned up, boots pushing into fresh snow that hadn't yet crusted. He looked down the length of Main Street. Empty, save for a stray dog near the saloon and the faint sound of someone splitting wood 3 houses away. It was the kind of cold that cut through cloth, and yet for some reason, he didn't go back inside. He stood still, quiet, listening, not for danger but for the absence of it. His eyes drifted toward the side of the house where a single window showed a flicker of lamplight. Clara was awake. She had taken to rising early without being told, and Thorne noticed her presence had begun shaping the rhythm of the house. His bread didn't sit as long on the shelf anymore. The basin stayed dry. The stove was always hot before he lit it. Back inside, he found her seated at the table, hair still damp from washing, hands wrapped around a mug of chicory. She wore the same dress again, sleeves rolled up now, a needle in hand as she carefully adjusted a loose hem. She looked up, off her glance, not quite a smile, not distant either. You don't sleep much, she said. Thorne hung his coat. Not since the war. Clara's expression shifted. You fought. He nodded. Union Army. Infantry. Came home 65. Never picked up a rifle again. You keep a pistol. Habit. She didn't question him further, but her eyes lingered longer than usual, as if trying to picture the man across from her in a uniform, in a place far from here, carrying weight he never spoke about. After breakfast, they moved to the back of the house, where Thorne kept a storage lean-to that hadn't been touched since spring. He handed her a pair of gloves from a chest near the doorway. Too big but warm. She pulled them on without complaint. "We'll stack the drywood here," he said. "Don't want to haul from the shed once the snow gets heavy." Clara nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask something?" He looked over. "Your wife. Was she from here?" Thorne didn't flinch. His eyes moved to the snow piling on the fence post. "She was from Eden Pass. Moved here after the war. School teacher. What was her name?" "Annalise." Clara waited. "She played piano. Laughed too loud. Thought this house needed curtains and a garden, not rifles and dry boots." A pause passed between them. "She died in the spring. 9 years ago. She and the baby both." Clara didn't speak right away. She picked up a piece of kindling, handed it to him, and began stacking the rest. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Nothing to be sorry for. It's just what happened." Clara didn't ask anything else, but her movements changed after that. Less cautious, more certain, like something in his words had given her permission to stop walking on glass. That afternoon, while Thorne rode to the southern edge of town to check in with a mail rider about a missing delivery, Clara remained behind. He left her with simple instructions. Keep the fire going, mind the pot if it boiled, don't answer the door unless she knew the voice. He didn't expect visitors. But just after midday, someone knocked. Clara froze where she stood. She was in the kitchen, drying tin cups with a cloth. The knock came again, louder this time. She moved slowly toward the front window, staying low, then peeked out. It was a woman, late 40s, coat trimmed with worn rabbit fur, bonnet tied too tight under the chin. Clara didn't recognize her. The woman knocked a third time, then stepped back and folded her arms. Clara opened the door crack. "Yes. You the girl staying with the sheriff?" Clara didn't answer. The woman squinted. "My name's Maribel Cutter. I live off North Ridge Road. I came to see what kind of girl he's taken in." Clara opened the door a little wider, but only just. "I don't think that's your business," she said quietly. Maribel's mouth twitched. "Town's making it our business. Man like Thorne Gallen takes in a girl off the street. Folks want to know why." Clara said nothing. "You should know people remember Annalise," Maribel added. "They won't take kindly to you sitting in her kitchen." Clara's hand tightened on the edge of the door. "I'm not here to replace anyone." "Maybe not, but you already did, far as they see it." Before Clara could answer, hoofbeats sounded on the road. Thorne's horse came around the corner at a steady trot. He didn't call out, didn't raise his voice. He just stopped at the edge of the porch, dismounted, and looked up. "Afternoon, Maribel." She turned slowly, tried to hide the way her eyes flicked toward Clara, then stepped back. "I was just introducing myself." "No need. She's under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know." Maribel didn't argue. She adjusted her coat, gave Clara one last glance, then walked off. Thorne stepped inside without a word. Clara shut the door behind him. "You all right?" She nodded, but the strain in her shoulders was plain. "She thinks I don't belong here," Clara said. "She doesn't matter, but others might." Thorne looked at her a moment, then spoke low. "They'll talk either way. Doesn't mean we have to listen." Clara's eyes held his. "You don't regret taking me in?" "No," he said plainly. "I'd do it again." That night, she moved her valise from beside the door to the room where she slept, folded the cloth around her mother's photograph with more care than usual, set it on the small table near the cot. She didn't say thank you, and he didn't need her to, but in the quiet, she stayed near the fire a little longer. And when Thorne passed her the extra quilt without a word, she took it without hesitation. They didn't speak of belonging after that, because now, whether the town liked it or not, Clara Nels was no longer just a guest. She was home. The cold stayed longer than usual that year. By the end of the week, the snow had hardened along the edges of the buildings, and every morning brought a sheet of frost that clung to the windows until midday. The town grew quieter. Even the saloon kept shorter hours. Hemlock Reach had slipped into the kind of hush that made time stretch. Inside the sheriff's house, routines were beginning to form. Clara rose early, often before Thorne. She kept the fire going, cleaned the stove, and sometimes made coffee before he'd even stepped out of his room. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be told. She simply worked like someone who needed to prove she still belonged somewhere. Thorne noticed all of it. He also noticed the things she never said. She never spoke about the months before the stagecoach, never mentioned her uncle again. And though she'd shared the photo of her mother, she hadn't said a word about her father. Not his name, not where he'd gone. That silence wasn't accidental. And Thorne, who had carried more grief than most men twice over, understood that the things people refused to say often mattered most. One morning, while checking the shed behind the office, he found Clara sorting tools, stacking, wiping, organizing without being asked. "You don't need to keep doing all this," he told her. "I know," she said. He nodded slowly. "Still trying to earn your place?" She looked over her shoulder, then down at her hands. "I'm trying not to lose it." Thorne let the silence linger before speaking. "You don't need to hold your breath here." Clara blinked, but didn't reply. She set down the wrench in her hand and stepped out into the daylight without a word. Later that day, a rusted wagon rolled into town from the South Road, hauling supplies for the winter stores. The driver was a talkative man named Keller Rusk, always eager to trade stories and rumors. Thorne met him by the depot, helped unload a few sacks of flour, and listened without comment as Keller spoke of another town down near Three Forks where a girl had gone missing after being left with relatives. "Left behind," Keller said, wiping his nose on a rag. "Just like that. Folks said the uncle blamed her for everything. Said she caused trouble back east, made a scene." Thorne kept his tone flat. "She have a name?" Didn't catch it, but she was 17. Pale thing, brown hair, thin as rope. Thorne finished unloading and walked off without another word. That night, after supper, he stepped into the room where Clara was folding laundry near the hearth. Her face was calm, but her hands moved quickly. "You left her back east?" he asked gently. She slowed. "New York, Albany. You lived with your uncle?" She nodded once. "Something happened before you left?" Clara didn't answer right away. She sat down on the edge of the chair, hands in her lap. "He wasn't violent. Not in ways you could prove. He just made it clear I wasn't welcome. Ever since my mother died." She paused, her voice even. "His wife didn't like me either. Said I looked at her husband wrong. Said I talked too little, watched too much." "You do watch," Thorne said. Clara glanced at him. "I didn't mean to. I've learned that listening is safer than speaking." Thorne nodded. "That true where you lived before?" She swallowed hard. "I left once. Ran away. A man took me in, promised me work, said I could stay with his sister. But there wasn't a sister. Just a room. Just him." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Thorne leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. "What happened? I got out. Someone found me hiding behind a feed store near Ridgeberry. They put me back on a train. Said I couldn't be trusted alone." He looked at her long and steady. "No one believed you. No one listened long enough to try." Silence hung again. Then she added, softer, "That's why they left me. Not just because they were cruel, because they thought I was ruined." Thorne stepped forward, crouched near a chair. "You're not." She looked at him, lips tight, eyes shining but dry. "You're not ruined," he said again, quieter this time. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That night, she stayed near the fire longer than usual. She read through an old copy of a law manual Thorne had tucked behind the stove, tracing her finger along the words like they meant something more than ink. Before bed, she placed her mother's photo on the shelf beside Thorne's books. Not hidden, not wrapped away, visible. And when she walked to her cot, she did so with her shoulders straight, not braced. Thorne watched from the doorway. For the first time since he'd taken her in, he saw something in her that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not uncertainty, a beginning. The first real snowstorm came that night, sweeping in from the northern ridges and burying Hemlock Reach in silence and white. By dawn, the roads were gone. The tops of fences disappeared beneath smooth drifts, and the sheriff's office looked like a structure drawn in chalk, soft-edged, fading into the wind. No one opened their shops. No one tried to travel. The town disappeared under the weight of weather that gave no warning and took no time to settle. Inside the sheriff's house, the fire burned hotter than usual. Thorne had stacked extra with the day before without knowing why. Clara had boiled beans and salt pork late. without prompting. Somehow, they'd both prepared without speaking a word about the storm they'd felt coming. By mid-morning, the windows were covered in frost. Thorne sat near the table, sharpening one of his old camp knives. Clara was across from him, mending a torn shirt cuff of his with tight, even stitches. The room was quiet but comfortable, not the silence of strangers anymore, but the kind that came with trust. "You were reading my law book again," Thorne said without lifting his head. Clara nodded. "Some of it. You understand any of it?" "Not the legal parts," she said, "but I like the structure. The idea that something written down could matter more than who said it." He gave a faint sound, almost approval. "The written law is one thing. Towns like this run more on memory and opinion." Clara set down the shirt. "Then why carry the badge?" Thorne looked up slowly. "Because I'd rather stand between people than behind them." She thought about that. "Did you always want to be a sheriff?" "No, I wanted a farm." "What changed?" He tapped the knife edge against the table once, then shrugged. "Life did." The wind howled outside just then, loud and sharp, pressing hard against the walls. The windows creaked. Clara stiffened. "Storm won't break the house," Thorne said. "It stood longer than I've been here." She nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on the door, her fingers curling under the table. "You all right?" he asked. "It's the sound," she murmured. "The wind. Something about it?" She didn't answer immediately. "Then, there was a night like this. Back in New York. Storm louder than this one. My uncle locked me out of the house over something. I don't even remember what. I slept in the shed." Thorne's jaw tightened. "How old?" 12. She looked away like she'd said too much. Thor didn't speak. He stood, walked to the hearth, took down the tin kettle, and poured hot water into 2 cups. He slid one across to her without a word. She took it, cradling the warmth with both hands. "I never had a home that stayed," she said quietly. "Just places to pass through, rooms to wait in." "You've been here 6 weeks," Thorne replied. "That's longer than some who were born here." She looked at him carefully. "You ever think about leaving?" "Thought about it every winter. Never did." "Why?" "Couldn't find a reason to go. Couldn't find one to stay either. Until now." He said plainly, eyes steady. Clara didn't blink, but her lips parted like she was about to speak and couldn't find the words. The storm pressed harder against the house. Thorne stood again, opened the front door just a crack to check the porch. Snow was halfway up the steps. The sky was still white, still moving. He shut the door quickly and drew the latch. They worked together through the afternoon, checking the stove, preparing more food, moving blankets closer to the fire. At one point, Clara found herself sitting near the bookshelf, sorting through old ledgers and documents. One of them was wrapped in oilcloth, personal, not official. Inside were several pages of Thorne's handwriting, clean and controlled. "What's this?" she asked. He glanced over. "My will." Clara froze. "You planning to leave that to someone?" she asked. "I was," he replied. "Before, when I didn't have anyone else. Thought it should go to the town or to one of the veterans groups downstate." She didn't say anything. He added, "I've been thinking of rewriting it." "To include who?" He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't answer out of habit. He answered from something he hadn't said aloud before. "You." Clara didn't move. Her hand stayed on the papers, but her breathing changed, deeper now, steadier. "Thorne," she started. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just know it." That night, they sat by the fire in the shared quiet that had become their way. No questions, no pressure, just heat, light, and presence. Clara didn't return to her room right away. She sat curled under a blanket on the floor, the law book resting on her knees, the pages worn from her fingers. And Thorne watched her, not with pity, not with caution, but with the kind of recognition that only came when 2 people had survived long enough to stop explaining who they were. When the storm finally began to soften, she looked up. "I'm not afraid here," she said. He nodded once. "You shouldn't be." By the 3rd morning after the storm, the wind had quieted, and the sky opened into a sharp, clear blue. The sun glinted off the snow, too bright to look at for long, but it meant the worst had passed. Men began shoveling paths from their doors to their wagons. Children kicked at frozen piles with sticks. Hemlock Reach stirred slowly, still cautious from the cold. but returning to its routines. Inside the sheriff's house, Clara was beating dust from the blankets with short, firm motions near the porch rail, cheeks red from the cold, breath coming in little clouds. She didn't ask Thorne whether she should help that morning. She just worked. He stood on the steps with a mug in hand, watching the town stir to life. After a minute, he said, "You ever seen a town like this?" Clara paused, then shook her head. "I never stayed anywhere long enough to remember how the streets bent." He nodded slightly. "Hemlock Reach ain't special, but it holds." She returned to her work, but her eyes lingered longer on the faces of people walking past. Men tipping hats, women glancing curiously, a few expressions more cautious than kind. She noticed everything, and Thorne knew it. Later that day, they made a supply run. Not far, just to the general store at the corner of Main. Thorne needed lamp oil and nails. Clara needed thread. It was the first time she'd walked beside him in public since Maribel Cutter had knocked on their door. As they entered, the usual bell didn't ring. The air inside was heavy with the smell of dried apples and musty wool. Two women stood near the back, whispering until they noticed Clara. Then the whispering stopped. Clara kept her eyes forward. Thorne noticed but said nothing. He grabbed the oil tin, paid, and turned to leave. "Sheriff," came a voice behind the counter. Mr. Franks, the storekeeper, older, rail-thin, not a man who liked confrontation. "That girl, she your kin?" Thorne turned. "She's staying with me." Franks shifted uncomfortably. "Some folks been asking about why she's here, what kind of girl she is." Clara went still beside the front shelf, eyes locked on the wood grain. Thorne said nothing for a long beat. Then, "She's the kind that survived what others couldn't. That's all anyone needs to know." He turned and walked out. Clara followed, head low, fists in her coat pockets. Back home, she didn't speak for a while. She folded thread into a tin, cleaned the counter, stirred the stew on the stove. Thorne watched her from across the room. "They don't have to like me," she finally said. "But I thought maybe they'd stop looking through me." Thorne didn't offer comfort. He offered truth. "They won't stop. Not all of them. Not yet." She turned, voice steady. "Then maybe I should go." He stood. Not fast, not dramatic. He just stepped forward. "Where?" She hesitated. "You got people? Money? Work waiting somewhere I don't know about?" "No," she whispered. "Then don't talk about leaving like it's a decision on the table." He didn't say it out of anger. He said it with certainty, with something final in his voice. "I can't be a burden," she said. "You're not. You don't even know everything about me." "I know enough." She looked away. "You're not hiding something dangerous, are you?" he asked. "No." "You didn't hurt anyone?" "No." "Then we're done worrying about what other people think." That evening, Thorne took down an old wooden box from the top shelf of the wardrobe. It was covered in dust, the lid stiff from years untouched. Inside were items from a life he hadn't shared in full. Annalise's teaching certificate, a swatch of fabric from the cradle, a pair of tiny shoes, unworn. He handed the shoes to Clara without explanation. She held them carefully, not asking whose they were. She understood. "I didn't get to be a father," Thorne said, voice low. "Didn't get to be a husband for long either. But I remember how it felt when someone needed me." Clara's hands trembled slightly around the tiny soles. She set them back in the box, slowly, gently, and wiped her fingers on her skirt. "I don't want to replace anyone." "You don't have to," he replied. "You're here. That's enough." She didn't cry, but her face shifted and her shoulders relaxed. Later, as they sat at the table, Clara reached for the ledger he'd been keeping. She ran her finger down the list of items logged over the past month. Beans, tobacco, oil, nails. "You never write my name," she said. "I haven't had a reason to." "Maybe you do now." He looked up. "Write it," she said. "So if something happens to you, they'll know I was here." He took the pencil from the counter, turned the page, and wrote 4 simple words at the top of a clean sheet. "Clara Nels, resident." She stared at it like it was a mark carved in stone. Then she nodded once and walked to the back room without another word. Thorne closed the ledger. Outside, the snow had begun to melt from the eaves. Inside, something else had started to hold. By mid-February, the freeze had finally begun to loosen its grip. Water dripped steadily from rooftops. The roads turned to mud. Boots sank half an inch with each step, and the wooden planks in front of the saloon warped just enough to creak under pressure. But the snowmelt meant more than just mess. It meant survival. It meant spring was on the way, and for a town like Hemlock Reach, that mattered. Inside the sheriff's house, the atmosphere had changed in ways too subtle for strangers to notice, but impossible to miss for the two who lived there. Clara no longer paused before touching things. She moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, not caution. Thorne found her one morning putting up a strip of muslin she'd dyed using leftover chicory grounds. Nothing fancy, just a curtain over the pantry window. She didn't ask before she hung it. He didn't stop her. That same week, Thorne received a letter, one that came sealed in thick wax from the territorial office downstate. Inside was the usual rotation notice, a reminder that a replacement deputy was due to arrive in spring and that the sheriff could request reassignment if he wished. They asked, again, whether he intended to serve another year. He folded the letter, set it aside, and said nothing. But Clara noticed it. "You thinking of leaving?" she asked, late that evening as they stood near the stove. "No." "Then why do you look like you are?" He didn't answer right away. "Because the offer reminds me that I could," he said. Clara held his gaze. "And that bothers you?" He looked down at his hands. "It used to feel like staying was a punishment. Now, I don't want to imagine leaving." She didn't press the topic again, but she saw the way he kept checking that folded letter on the desk, like it carried a decision he hadn't made yet. A few days later, while Thorne was checking the south end of town, Clara ventured out alone. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first she'd gone without saying exactly where. She walked the edge of Hemlock Reach's western boundary, stopping near the schoolhouse that had been closed since the last teacher moved north to care for a sick brother. The bell above the door was rusted, but the windows were intact. Inside, desks sat in neat rows, gathering dust. Clara stood outside the threshold for a long time. When she returned, boots muddy and hair windswept, she found Thorne in the woodshed. "There's no teacher here," she said. "I know. Why hasn't the town hired one?" "No one's applied. No one wants the job bad enough to stay." She stepped forward. "What if I wanted it?" He stopped stacking wood. "You don't have teaching papers," he said. "I could study. I read every day. I've helped children before. You'd need approval from the township. You'd need patience." "I have time," she said. Thorne looked at her closely. "Why?" "Because I want to be more than someone who was taken in. I want to give something back." That evening, he wrote a letter to the school board. No promises, just a statement of interest. He didn't tell her what he wrote, and she didn't ask. But she brought out her mother's photograph again and placed it near the window where light caught it in the morning. Later that week, a man named Arthur Spear came to town, a former storekeeper from Cotter's Gulch who claimed Clara owed his brother money for passage west. He arrived with a bitter face and no papers. Claimed she'd stolen from his kin. Claimed she was trouble. Thorne didn't let him get past the porch. "You got a warrant?" Thorne asked. "No," the man said, "but I got the truth." "Then write it down," Thorne said calmly, "and send it to the court." "She's not who you think she is," Spear added, spitting in the snow. "Girls like that don't change." Thorne stepped forward, jaw tight. "You ride back out. You don't return. Not unless you got more than words." The man didn't push it. He left, bitter and red-faced, but Clara had seen him from the window. And for the first time in weeks, she looked afraid again. "They're going to follow me forever," she said that night. "Aren't they?" Thorne sat beside the hearth, elbows on his knees. "Probably. I'll never be clean in their eyes." "Then stop trying to be." She looked at him. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone who only came to take." Clara didn't reply. But the next morning, she gathered every loose document she owned, letters, notes, the cracked photo, and tucked them in a clean envelope. She labeled it, "For the sheriff, if I'm gone." She gave it to Thorne. "Just in case," she said. He didn't take it. "You're not leaving," he said. "You can't promise that." "I can promise I'll stand in front of you, no matter who knocks." She let the envelope fall back onto the table. That night, the town was quiet again. But inside the house, Clara left her door open slightly for the first time, and the warmth of the hearth stretched just far enough to reach both rooms. And Thorne, for the first time in 9 years, took down Annalise's shawl from the nail in the wall, folded it once, and placed it in the chest, carefully, respectfully, as if it no longer needed to be on display to be remembered. By the time March settled over Hemlock Reach, the thaw had reached the hills, and trickles of water began running beneath the frozen soil. The sky turned a little softer each day. The air carried the faint smell of wet pine and turned dirt. With the shift in weather came small signs of movement: supply wagons from the north, railroad scouts passing through, letters finally arriving on time. But more than anything, the season brought questions that had waited all winter to be answered. Sheriff Thorne Gallen had not yet responded to the letter from the territorial office. It sat where he left it, beneath a jar of rifle oil in the drawer of his desk, unopened for over a week. He knew what it asked, and he knew what it meant if he answered yes or no. The badge had once filled a space in him that grief had hollowed out. Now, he wasn't sure the job still belonged to the man he had become since Clara Nels entered his home. That morning, he found her outside on the porch with her sleeves rolled and her boots muddy. She had begun planting onions in the long wooden box beside the steps. It was her idea. She didn't ask if she could. She simply said they needed to grow something that would last into summer. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked up as he joined her. "You think I'll still be here in summer?" she asked. Thorne didn't answer at first. "Do you want to be?" "I do," she said without hesitation. "But I don't think the town wants me to be." Thorne scanned the road. Two boys kicked a ball of bundled cloth across the dirt. A woman passed with a basket of wash. No one looked their way. No one said anything. "They'll learn to live with it," he said. "And if they don't, then I'll live with them not liking it." Later that day, the reply from the school board arrived, written in clean script on official parchment. The envelope was thin but firm. Clara read it slowly at the table, her eyes scanning every word twice. "They said I can begin as a teaching assistant," she whispered. "If I prove myself, I can apply for a permanent role next term." Thorne sat across from her, watching. "You're going to take it?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded. "I'll need to file papers. Meet with the town council," she added. "Maybe speak to people I don't like. Can handle that. I've handled worse." He didn't argue. The next day, she began cleaning the schoolhouse alone. She didn't wait for volunteers. She borrowed a bucket, soap, and an old mop from the church kitchen and worked until her hands turned raw from the cold water. Thorne came by late, after checking on a fence repair at the mills, and found her dragging a broken bench to the corner. "You sure this is what you want?" he asked again. Clara turned, hair tied back, eyes steady. "I never had a place to grow up. I'm trying to make one where someone else can." He helped her move the last desk, and together they pried open the stuck windows so the room could breathe again. But not everything in town sat quietly. Word had spread that Clara was aiming for a formal role at the school. Most didn't speak of it openly. But Thorne heard things, questions disguised as gossip. One man in the saloon said he'd seen Clara talking to herself behind the general store. Another whispered that she must have lied about her age. Maribel Cutter claimed she'd seen Clara take coin from the till at the depot, though she gave no proof. It wasn't about what Clara had done. It was about the idea of her being allowed to stay. That evening, as Thorne walked home through the cold dusk, he found Clara seated on the steps again, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes blank. "They think I don't see them watching," she said as he approached. "But I do. Every sideways glance, every whisper, 'You've done nothing wrong.' That doesn't matter," she said. "People don't need proof to believe what they want." Thorne sat beside her. The boards creaked under their weight. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "You were right when you said I don't talk much," he said. "But maybe that's not what you need right now." He stood, went inside, and returned with a thin book, something his wife had once used for teaching letters to children. He handed it to her. "I kept it," he said, "for no reason. Now, maybe there is one." She took it, opened the cover, and ran her finger along the faded ink of Annalise Gallen's name. "She would have liked you," he said. "You don't know that." "I do." Clara looked up at him, the wind brushing hair across her face. "I'm scared," she said, her voice small. "You still showing up?" "Yes. That's all you need to do." Later that night, she placed the book on the mantel, next to her mother's photograph. It didn't look like a shrine. It looked like a beginning. And Thorne, without saying a word, returned to his desk, pulled out the letter from the territorial office, and wrote his reply. Short, certain, and final. He would not be requesting reassignment. He would remain sheriff of Hemlock Reach because this place still needed him, because she still needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed them both just as much. The final frost came in early April. By the second week, wildflowers began breaking through the softer soil near the ridge line, and the town's outer paths dried enough for wagons to pass without getting stuck. Hemlock Reach, so long buried under winter's stillness, began to stir like something waking from a long, cautious sleep. The air smelled different, brighter, and in the still mornings, there were birds again. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara stood at the front of the single classroom, smoothing the folds of her worn dress, watching dust dance through the light that streamed in from the windows she had washed twice. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't let it show. The blackboard behind her had been cleaned. The benches had been repaired, and on the table beside her sat a small stack of readers Thorne had bought from a traveling bookman using his own money. 3 children sat in the front row, 1 boy from the sawmill, 2 girls from the outskirts near North Hollow. All of them fidgeted with their hands, uncertain, unsure what to expect. Clara cleared her throat. "I'm not going to ask if you want to be here," she said gently, "but I'm glad you are." It was not a grand speech, but it was enough. She began with letters and moved slowly into rhythm drills. She stumbled once, mispronouncing a Latin root she'd only read aloud to herself, but none of the children noticed. They followed her instructions, eyes curious, eager, even if shy. By the end of the hour, one of the girls smiled. That was enough. When the last child left, Clara stood alone in the doorway of the schoolhouse and exhaled slowly. Behind her, silence settled over the room. But it wasn't the same kind of silence that once defined her life. This one held promise. This one belonged to her. She walked back to the sheriff's house with dirt on her shoes and her heart beating differently. Thorne was out back, mending the fence along the edge of the lot. He heard her approach and looked up. No words passed between them. She just gave a small nod, tired but full. "Went all right?" he asked. She gave a faint smile. They listened. That evening, Thorne cooked supper, a quiet stew with dried herbs and the last of the salt pork. He didn't say much while they ate. Clara didn't either. But when the dishes were done, she handed him a folded piece of paper. It was her own version of a will. Simple, unofficial, but she wanted him to have it. "You planning on dying soon?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I want to know. I want you to know what matters to me." He didn't open it right away, just tucked it into a drawer beside his own. Afterward, they stepped out onto the porch. The sky was pink at the edges, and the breeze was warm enough that neither of them reached for a coat. Down the road, the general store had its windows open. Someone was playing a harmonica on the far side of town. Life was carrying on. "You staying now?" Thorne asked. "I think I've been staying this whole time," Clara said. "I just didn't know how to believe it yet." "You believe it now." She looked at him, steady and calm. "Yes." The next morning, something changed. Not loud, not sudden, just different. Clara set an extra place at the table without thinking. Thorne brought her a new pair of gloves without being asked. They spoke more that day than most, not about the past, but about what to plant in the garden, about whether to keep the porch rail or replace it, about what books the children might need next. Weeks passed that way. The town softened. People nodded when they saw her. Some even spoke. The children came back each morning without needing to be told. A mother donated a stack of slates and a wrapped bundle of pencils. The whispers stopped. One Sunday, Clara returned home to find something waiting on the small table in the front room. A carved wooden sign with her name on it. Clara Nels, schoolmistress. Thorne didn't mention it, but she saw the wood shavings in the corner of the shed. She placed the sign beside the photo of her mother. By the end of spring, no one asked who she was anymore. By early summer, no one asked why she stayed. And by then, it didn't matter, because she was no longer someone taken in. She was someone who belonged. Thorne stood beside her on the ridge one evening, watching the horizon glow orange and red as the sun dropped behind it. He said nothing. She didn't need him to, because staying had become a language of its own. And in that quiet, with nothing needing to be spoken, a man and a girl, once strangers, stood as something more. Family. Home.